week's beautiful. I want to say something about this week's Parsha. And it's the portion of Vayishlach. And in this portion, there is a lot of discussion that has evolved around one of the most striking incidents in the Torah. And that is Jacob is about ready to meet Esau, whom he had not seen for 22 years. So let me speak just for a while and set the stage. There are two ways of looking at the Jacob-Esau story. One is to look at them in the Bible as individuals. Jacob and Esau were twin brothers, and they were, of course, the children of Isaac and Rebekah, of Yitzchak and Rivkah. And the truth of the matter is that when we look at the text itself, I think one could say that Esau comes across as a very sympathetic character. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, one can argue that on many levels, he was more caring for his parents than even Jacob. He really was there for them. He's the one whom Isaac asks to bring venison to so that he would have something to eat before blessing him. But, and this is very critical, the rabbis, after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, they looked at these biblical characters and they did not see them as individuals as they appear in the Bible. They saw them as representative of two peoplehoods. And Jacob became the representative of Israel, of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people. And Esau becomes the representative, believe it or not, of Rome. And ultimately after Rome, a couple hundred years later, Catholicism itself. It's this clash between these two worlds. But I want to underscore that it's the rabbis who look at the text and they're trying to draw from the text meaning to life, and they are seeing it more broadly. And the truth of the matter is they're taking it out of its literal meaning, what's called pshuto shel mikra, the literal meaning of the text. As a matter of fact, when one looks at the story of the controversy between Ishmael and Isaac in the prior generation, actually, Isaac and Ishmael, there's not much said about their conflict. The conflict was more between their mothers, between Hagar and Sarah. And Ishmael, when one reads the Torah, he comes across as a very sympathetic character, very sympathetic. But it's often the case that people look at the Ishmael, where Ishmael was cast out, and Isaac, in a certain sense, was cast out at the Akedah. They look at it as the clash between Judaism and Islam. Now, what does Ishmael have to do with Islam? Islam comes on the scene in the 6th, 7th century. Ishmael is way, way, way before. But the reality is that Palestinians and Arabs, Aravim, they venerate Ishmael. When you go to the cave of Machpelah, it's not Yitzchak, the centerpiece for the Arab community, it's Ishmael. So my point is that there's a certain parallelism between these generations. There's a parallelism in that both the stories, and there is a conflict between Isaac and Ishmael. We all know that Sarah says Ishmael can't stay, cast him out, and all of that. We've been through that many times. But we can look at that story and we can analyze it as it occurs in a family, individuals, mothers who are in who are clashing, and they have and half brothers who are clashing, and one can look at it that way. But more broadly, it's often seen as even though it's not at all the literal meaning, as I said before, as the clash between Judaism and Islam. And similarly, what we're about ready to do is to see this famous story of Jacob about ready to meet Esau, but we're going to take it from the perspective of global history, of the rabbis looking at not as Jacob and Esau, who are in confrontation. Jacob took the blessings, and then he flees for 22 years. He comes back. He's about ready to meet. But we're going to take it more broadly. And so what the text says is, and this is a text that we've studied, but I want to give it a little twist today. It says that Jacob is preparing for Esau to return, to meet Esau, and he sends out emissaries, and the emissaries report back to him that Esau is coming, Varbameyot Ishimo, he's coming with 400 people. Now, for the student of the Bible, whenever you see 400, you know that that is really a real army. That is not a ragtag group. That is a group that's ready to go out and fight. For example, when David was fighting in the beginning there, he's described as having 200 men with him, 400 with him. Esau, it appears, is ready to do battle. And so Jacob has to prepare for that possibility. And he prepares for the possibility. He does prepare for the possibility of battle. He also prepares gifts for Esau in case he can make peace for Esau. And he also prepares for prayer. And then this is what the text says. Julie, I think if you could, if you're on, if you're able to mute everyone, that would be helpful. So the text says the following. Vayakam balaylahu. If you have the text in front of you, I'm sorry, it's not on the screen. Chapter 32, sentence 23. And Jacob rose that night. This is the night which is going to precede when he's going to be meeting Esau. And he takes his family, Vayavireim etanachal, and he passes them over the small water stream. And then it says, Vayivater Yaakov levado, that Jacob was left alone. And then one of the most famous expressions, Vayeyavek ish imo, and a man, a mysterious man, wrestled with him ad alot hashachar, until the morning dawn. So Jacob is in a wrestling match with this mysterious man. Let me read the text. Vayar kilo yocholo, and this mysterious man, and one wonders who is this person. It's not even a man. It says it's Ish, but who knows what it is. Some say it was an angel. Whose angel? Vayigabachaf yerecho, and the angel, or this mysterious person, touches Jacob's thigh, his loins. Vateka kaf yerech Yaakov behafgo imo, and Jacob leaves this wrestling. He's limping. And then we all know the story. Vayomesh alcheni ki ola hashachar. And this mysterious person says to Jacob, allow me to go. The dawn has come. And Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go till you bless me. And he says to Jacob, what is your name? Jacob says, my name is Jacob. And this mysterious being gives Jacob another name, and his name is Yisrael. So I want to begin by looking at that word, Vayeyovek, and they wrestled. And this is what I want to say. The great Rashi, who was born in 1040, and I've mentioned to you, if I could follow someone around, I'd like to follow Rashi. He is, I think, more quoted as a commentary than any other commentary. Even scholars, often, Robert Alter is always quoting Rashi. If you've read any of Alter's work, which they're magnificent, he tries to offer commentary in the style of Rashi. Rashi was very concise, very to the point. So Rashi says that word vaye ovek comes from the word avak, which means dust. And what he argues is that they were in a physical battle. They were physically wrestling with each other. And they're out in the field. They're not on some kind of tarp. They're not in a gymnasium. They're out in the field. And as they're wrestling, they both fall to the ground and the dust rises. And so the great Rashi, Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki, looks at this. And most of what Rashi says is not his own. His genius he was the kuntras. He was the one who took the greatest notes. He knew what to quote and how to quote it from earlier rabbinic sources, and he knew what to delete. So he says they were in a physical battle, a physical struggle, and in that struggle, the dust rises. Then he says the following, and I want to mention what he says, and I want to open it up for your interpretation. He says there's another interpretation, and that is that the word avak, he argues, is, I believe he says it's an Aramaic word. And Rashi, Lashitato, Rashi follows a certain trend that he says that there are some words in the Bible that are not Hebraic in their original. I mean, we know that to be the case. For example, Paro, the name Pharaoh, that's not a Hebrew name, that was his name. Or Pharaoh gives Joseph an Egyptian name, Safnas Paneach, and so on. There are words in the Bible that are not they're not Hebrew words. So he says avak is not a Hebrew word, but the Hebrew equivalent of avak is chavak, which means to embrace. Very different interpretation. In other words, whereas the simple interpretation is that Esau and Jacob are physically going at it, and they're physically going at it in such a way that they fall to the ground and the dust is raised and all of that. The second interpretation is no, they were kind of in a dance. They were hugging each other, they were embracing each other. And that is what was happening between them. And then somehow the text says that whoever was hugging Jacob saw he could not overcome him. I'm not sure what that means. So I want to stop here. What I've said now may sound enigmatic, but we can all offer our own interpretations, and that's a very good thing. But there also is an approach to understanding Parshanut, to understanding the Bible, reading a text and trying to understand what is its deeper meaning. So when presenting this, again, that there are two views, at least according to this rabbinic text, as to what was happening. One is that the dust was rising as they were battling each other, and the other is they were embracing each other, that the word vayeyovek has nothing to do with dust. It has something to do with they saw each other and they hugged, and that was the point of tension. What do you think? What is being said here? What's the deeper message here? Anyone? We've never taken it from this perspective. Estelle, please.
I just sort of do you think that the rabbis had an ulterior motive when they said that the two brothers were fighting rather than truly embracing? Do you think they had an ulterior motive because they wanted to have Jacob as the person as part of Judaism?
Yes. The short answer to that, Estelle, is yes. I think they were very, very motivated by what they were experiencing. And they were living at a time when Rome had just destroyed the temple. Jerusalem was in ruins. And the Jews were were cast out. They were in exile, and in Rome, you could go under the Arch of Titus and all of that, march down the Tiber River as slaves. And I think they were commenting on that. They were sort of saying that what we're experiencing now is this battle, this physical battle between Rome and between Israel. And maybe their message was, don't be miyayish, don't despair, as Jacob in the end, although he limped, he was wounded, as he overcame, so too will we overcome. And as a matter of fact, remember that Jacob is given another name, and the added name that he's given is Israel, Yisrael. And in the Bible, you've heard me say this 1,000 times, names are not just names. Names are descriptions of who we are. Well, in the Bible, sometimes the actual name is explained. And here the Bible says that whoever is confronting Jacob says to him, your name will not only be Jacob, your name will be Israel, Yisrael. And the language is Kisarita im Elokim banashim vatuchal, because you physically fought with a strong enemy and you prevailed. You did not succumb. So Estelle, I think this is the rabbi's way of saying what we're experiencing is what Jacob went through with Yisrael. And even though Jacob was wounded in the hollow of his thigh, and we've been wounded, Jerusalem has been destroyed, the temple has been destroyed. Nonetheless, as Jacob prevailed, we will prevail because we are a people and we are called Bnei Yisrael. We are called people who have the gumption and the backbone to stand up and to defend ourselves. Rabbi, and this text, when you look at it on that level, this is now the first interpretation of Rashi, that they were actually physically struggling with each other, is seen as a paradigm text of how we are to deal with anti-Semites, not only with Rome, whom the rabbis were dealing with, but Esau becomes the example par excellence of the enemy throughout the ages, going through the ages, whether it's the Crusades, it could be the Crusades, or whether it's going to be the Chilmoniki pogroms happened in Kishinev in the beginning of the 20th century, and indeed the Shoah. It becomes all of that, and it becomes the state of Israel. It becomes the state of Israel who says, we're not going to be pushed around anymore. We're not going to be pushed around anymore. And I'll say something very radical. Rabbi, yeah, okay. Please.
Rabbi, you're talking about separating dust raising and embracing, but why can't it be both? Why we have the capacity for both, and we draw from both. So yes. Yeah, there are two distinctive things, but is it necessary to separate them?
Right. I absolutely. One could see them as conflating.
You would draw upon them as needed.
And Ruby, how would you see the embracing? There is some kind of conflict. It seems like Jacob was being challenged. So I more readily understand the challenge of a physical fight, wrestling, falling to the ground, raising the dust. But the great Rashi seems to be saying, wait a minute, there's another challenge, and that is the challenge of the embrace. The two seem to be.
Maybe when he was wrestling, he was inwardly hoping for the embrace. Maybe that, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, could be.
Aki?
Yes, Arnie.
So there are two things I just would like to address. One is that Jacob takes from this incident, and when he does meet up with Esau, they embrace, and Esau kisses him on the neck.
Yes.
But kiss is also from the root of bite, I think.
Yes.
So it's also kind of parallel to whether the racing is you know, like the embrace, like the wrestling. If the wrestling is embracing or wrestling, is
Yes,
it a kiss or is it a bite? So to me, what it means is that that you know we always want peace, but we have to stand up for ourselves when necessary. We have to be who we are and stand up for ourselves as Israel.
right.
The other point that I'm curious about is the whole thing about Jacob's thigh being compromised, and he's limping and he's disabled, but nowhere else from that point on does Jacob, as the individual, evidence a limp, a problem. He can't go down to Egypt. He has to go in a cart. No, he walks down to Egypt. You know, it's not a problem. So it's almost like there's something dreamlike about this occurrence. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. If I may just respectfully, everyone is open. It's an open mic. So whatever is happening in your holy homes, we can hear. So so whatever you can do so that we can, as best as we can, to remain focused. I look, I hear what you're saying. I mean, if Arnie, if you look at the last sentence in this chapter, it does say that he was hit in the hollow of the thigh, and that's why we do not consume the sciatic nerve. It's one of the 3 mitzvot that are given to the patriarchs and matriarchs before we became a people. That's found in Breshit. There's be fruitful and multiply, circumcision, and the third one is that we do not to this day eat the sciatic nerve. But it does say, the text does say that, the text says, here it is, the text in, if you have the Bible in front of you, it says in chapter 32, sentence 32, I'm looking at it now. This is after he's given the added name. It says, Vayizrach lo hashemesh, and the sun rose for Jacob. This is after this all-night battle. Kasher avar et Penuel, v'hu tzolea al Yerecho, and he was still limping. So he still had problems with his hip, with his thigh. But I think your point is well taken. After that, we don't see that. We see that Jacob seems to have overcome it. But I want to make this suggestion and get your feelings about this, and that is the following: that first interpretation, which is an interpretation which more broadly can be understood as the Jewish historical experience of us constantly facing an enemy prepared to do physical harm to us, has been part of our DNA. There's hardly a country that we've lived in that did not cast us out. Hardly. And I'll say something very, very radical. I'm indebted to America, very much indebted to America. But I think the jury is out as to what the future, first of all, what the future of America will be, but certainly what the future of Jews in America will be. What we're reading about these days is just about every day. There's another anti-Semitic happening, and it's almost become part of our culture. No one even bats an eyelash. It's sort of like something that we expect. And I think for a long time, for a long time, post-Shoah, it was just not the polite thing to do to attack Jews. But we're now many, many years later. We're 80 years later. Soon it's going to be a century after the Shoah. And the Shoah is going to, for Americans, it's going to be a footnote, literally a footnote in history. And we're beginning to see that things are becoming very, very difficult. We're beginning to see that even in America, there's a lot of Ahavah. What's going on in Paris, what's going on in London, what's going on in Poland, what's going on all over the world. It's quite something. It really is quite something. That battle against anti-Semitism is still alive and well. And I would argue that as much as we as the Jewish people should have learned from Jewish history to fight anti-Semitism, I believe deep down that there are many Jews in leadership who are afraid to raise a voice and fight anti-Semitism. There's this sense if we're going to fight anti-Semitism, we become somehow more vulnerable. We're going to draw more attention to ourselves. I think that's a lot of reason why the culture today is that for many people to take positions that are so anti-Israel, that's the popular position in many places, and to go against that norm is not so is not so simple. I know wherever we traveled in the activism days, Austria, Turkey, Poland, Germany, Argentina, all over the world, wherever we traveled to fight anti-Semitism, the leadership of the Jewish community invariably came up to us and said, Avi, leave. You are inspiring more anti-Semitism. Could you imagine?
The whole thing was very hot.
We come to Vienna to raise a voice against Kurt Waldheim. And what the leadership was saying to us is, we're inspiring anti-Semitism. We haven't gotten across the point that the more we stand up against anti-Semitism, the more our people are protected, not the more we are rendered vulnerable. So the fight against anti-Semitism is not an easy fight. And I think that there are Jews themselves who are reticent to really throw themselves into the fight. But if I were to be asked, what is the greatest challenge facing the American Jewish community and the Jewish community around the world, I would say that it's not anti-Semitism, even though we must fight anti-Semitism to the hilt. I'd like to argue that as much as the body of the Jewish people has been throughout history in trouble, it's the soul of the Jewish people that often has been in trouble. And Arnie, you touched on something. In the Hebrew language, the word for bite is noshach. The word for kiss is noshak. Almost the same letters. Just that last letter, is it a hard sound or is it a soft sound? Is it a bite or is it a kiss? And there is a kiss of love, but there is also a kiss of death. There is an embrace of friendship, but there's an embrace where we're going to try to, where the Jew is so embraced that we lose our Jewish identity as we assimilate. And that is what I think that second interpretation is all about. That second interpretation is talking about a whole different milieu. It's talking about times when, let us say, we're actually free. And there are times when we're not being physically challenged. But sometimes freedom could be our greatest challenge, because when one lives in a free society, one could be most open to assimilate. It's as Chaya said, I think it was Eliezer Berkovitz during the Who Was a Jew debate. He said sociologically, who was a Jew? One whose children, I think he said one whose grandchildren are Jewish. And the reality is that for most American Jews, their grandchildren, certainly in France and in England and in Sweden and in Finland, there are Jewish communities there. In Russia, for most, their grandchildren will not be Jewish. And that is what I think the paradigms here is all about. In my book, I write the following. Rashi offers a second suggestion. The word avak interchanges with chavak, embrace. According to this interpretation, the Torah not only records a physical confrontation, but also a meeting in which Jacob and the Ish, this mysterious being, embrace. And it was said by the Kitab Sofer of the 19th century that this idea resonates powerfully throughout history. There are times when the Ish, representative of the outside world, has tried to openly approach the Jew with the intent of convincing the Jew to assimilate. And I think that that is alive and well to this day. And I write, the soul of the Jewish people is at far greater risk than its body. And without a soul, we lose our direction and identity. And that's what's being emphasized here. What's being emphasized here is that if we're speaking about paradigm confrontation, there's a physical confrontation, and thank God there's a state of Israel. Because whatever happens in America, the state of Israel is saying, we have an army, we're strong, God willing, we'll prevail. We're not gonna give in, thank God. And of course, that second confrontation is to make sure that we retain our spiritual Jewish identity. I want to stop here and get your feelings on this and comments on it. A lot was said just now. Fern, any thoughts from Waveville?
I think assimilation is going to be the thing that's going to become the biggest problem, more so than anti-Semitism, because so many young people are just not interested. So the question is, what do we do as a community to get the young people to be interested in Judaism? I'm not talking that you have to become so observant or so religious, but just know that you're Jewish. And I think that's a big problem in a lot of communities right now.
Yes. And by the way, in Israel,
I sort of have a question.
yes.
Is it so terrible? I know it may sound heretical, but is it so terrible to assimilate outwardly instead of having everything come inwardly? Am I making myself?
What do you mean by that, Estelle?
Well, if say Jews, when a lot of sects or parts of Judaism feel if they go out into the world and spread their version of what basic Judaism, wouldn't that be just a positive way of looking at it instead of considering it as a negative part of assimilation? Would it be possible to spread our thoughts and feelings to the rest of the world or the rest of the people? There are Jews who feel that way. Tikkun olam.
That what you've described now is very commendable. You're describing Jews in their own way who identify as Jews.
And say, I'm just hypothetically speaking, say they intermarry with non-Jews. They're spreading their version of their Judaism to the outer world.
Yes. Look, this has been an argument that has been presented, although, Estelle, you may want to consider that the surveys indicate that, and look, I feel very strongly that, there was a time when intermarriage was the end of the line, the end of the Jewish line. Now, who knows? Who knows what could be in the next generation and the next generation? And we at the Bayit, we do welcome, what official, but we do welcome couples who everybody is welcome to the Bayit.
Well, instead of shutting them out.
Right, but the surveys indicate, Milton Himmelfarb said it in a very, very striking way. He was a sociologist, I believe. He said, what do you call the grandchildren of American Jews who intermarry? He said it very starkly, so get ready. He said, what do you call the grandchildren of American Jews who intermarry? Christian, because America is fundamentally a Christian country. And the surveys indicate that once there is intermarriage, that even though I think we have to do what we can to bring people in, but we've not been that successful, that's for sure. And that's the
Well,
point to sell. So it's one thing,
it's the point of view. Instead of saying the end of Judaism, it's the proliferation of Judaism.
Mhm.
I'm just presenting that point.
right. Anybody else want to?
Rabbi?
Yes, Ruby.
Okay, I'm thinking of a young person that I know very well, brought up in a very religious home. In terms of spiritual confrontation, I would say now is far away from that, recognizes it, appreciates it, but what is this particular person is now involved in environmental issues, carbon control and carbon, whatever. In other words, that's become his spiritual emphasis at this point. So it's a good thing, but he's found something else. And I don't know. So sometimes when you have these options, it'll take away maybe from the spiritual and present other possibilities to these young people. So on the surface, you'd say he's appreciative of Judaism, but not practicing it because he has something else instead. What he has is a good thing, but it's too bad that it has to be instead of combined with.
Right. But being concerned for the environment, Ruby, isn't that being concerned for the environment as you speak now beautifully? I mean, that is a Jewish, the environment is a Jewish issue.
Right.
But if that becomes the sole identity,
right.
If that becomes the sole identity,
right.
Then that's where the problem, it was Hillel. Being involved in the environment, look at what the Bayit is doing now. It's doing beautiful things, and the environment is very important. The Torah talks about, there's been articles and essays and books written on the Torah attitude towards the environment, that we're to serve the ground, we're to protect the ground, and it's all very, very critical. So I think that's a very good thing. But if social justice, if that's going to take the place of other issues that are also identified as particularistic Jewish stuff, let's say support for Israel. In many circles, support for the environment means that you can't be pro-Israel, as you probably know. There was just a story out of Washington. There's a national environmental group, I don't know the name, but they have a local faction in Washington. And they told the Jewish group to leave because they were pro-Israel.
Edith, there's other rabbi classes now.
Yes, please.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Rabbi, it's Jessica.
No, this is Beverly.
Rabbi? It's Jessica.
Yes.
Take care.
Yes, Jessica.
A few years ago, there was a program at the shul for teenagers. It was very positive. And my son said to me at the time, there should be more outreach and programs for teenagers to keep them involved.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Vivian, what's your thoughts on this? Any, because Ruby's raising some real issues.
I have many thoughts about it. One thing was that when I was active at the JCC on the Palisades, I was put in charge of dealing with the increasing rate of intermarriage going on. And I used to have groups meeting, and I met individually with them. And I remember having a special group meeting titled, "Will Your Grandchildren Be Jewish?" And it seemed like the children were not interested in Judaism, but they were not interested in converting to any other religion. They just wanted to be no religion. And it was very scary. And I think that it's become worse and worse all the time. And I think that the latest surveys that they've had have indicated that large numbers of young Jewish people in their teens and early 20s, and the young people have no religion. They don't identify with any religion. And it's very scary.
But it's not religion. We're a people, not necessarily a religion. That's the point.
Yeah.
We've got to be a people.
But
Still, they don't identify with the Jewish people. They don't. They identify.
I think-
that's where-
I
Well,
think
that's where our
what
work-
we have to say,
Scary.
even though some of the problem has to be our responsibility, but also there are the yeshivas that I think are failing us. If you send your children to the yeshivas, you expect that they'll come out with some kind of good feeling about
No, because
Judaism.
they're just teaching them the religion. They're not teaching them a people. I've known kids who come out of the religion who immediately go off and intermarry or whatever, because they only concentrate on the religion. The fact that we're a people is what makes it go.
Excuse me,
No.
but part of our problem, a big problem now, is that we have young Jewish progressives who identify as Jewish. And the way they express their Judaism is what they say is tikkun olam, where they support the Palestinian cause.
Yeah.
And I'm, a slave for pay, or that is not anything that they know about or care about. They are protecting what they and helping. They think it is the underdog, and it's just another anti-Semitic thing.
Yeah, you're
But
right.
they are our young Jewish children.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
somehow-
It's a real problem.
Tova has touched on a point where somehow in the quote unquote more progressive community, that's a community that in order to be part of that community, you have to be anti-Israel.
Right.
This is what's called the fancy language, the fancy word that's used.
Because they were never taught as a
The-
people. That's what I'm trying to get across.
Estelle,
What?
give someone else an opportunity. You've said it several
Right.
times.
No, it's okay. Bev, do you want to say it? Really,
Intersectionality? Is that
no,
what you're
Estelle is very emotional about it. So, Bev, yes.
I would like to say that as an early childhood teacher, that the school system has failed and that yeshivas have failed. Judaism is fun, and children need to see the joy of it, and not just on Purim, but every week, every time they come. I know that Chabad does not charge. The cost of being a Jew is very expensive. And I think somewhere along the line, especially in these struggling times, it's too expensive. It's too expensive to send your kids to a school and then have to pay for it, and camp and kosher and the whole 9 yards. It's too expensive. And I think that is something that factors into the situation. I think somehow the whole Jewish community, the Jewish people have to support those people who can send their kids to a free school and give the joy of Judaism. And give them the smell of Judaism, the fried onions. What could I tell you? Those activities mean a lot. The smell of and the stories that go with it. I think that at that, to start at a very early age, and of course to include parents and families, but to invite young children, very young children, and give them the taste of Judaism, the songs, the stories, the smell, all of it would be a big help. But it's not so. When sending your kid to yeshiva is more than $20,000 a year, come on. I mean, it's prohibitive. They say, who needs it? And that has been a very big problem.
Right.
I know that when my kids, my daughter, when she wanted to send her kids were small, she did not want to appeal to them for charity. And she didn't want to bring her annual financial report. Yeah, her annual
Income
financial.
tax.
Yeah, she did not want that. And even with us subsidizing her, she had to start her own little show and did it because she was very highly motivated. But it's unfortunate, she grew up in what I said was Siberia, in a non-Jewish area totally. But her kid is a rabbi. The other kid made Aliyah. She was okay. She did it, but she devoted herself to it. And I think that we have made a mistake by overlooking, children, what do they understand? What do they know? They know a lot, and they absorb a lot. And greater effort has to be made in that regard.
Right.
I believe that would go a long way.
Thank you, Bill. I don't have a watch or a clock here, and I don't want to take Ezra's time, but I want to, first of all, this has been a wonderful discussion. And but what I going back to the Torah text just for a moment, it's fascinating that from that one word vayeyovek, which is commonly understood to be a physical confrontation, they were raising the dust. Vayeyovek, they wrestled, and the relationship between wrestling and falling to the ground and dust and dirt is flying all over the place. But that second interpretation, that it could also mean chabak, that it could mean to hug, to embrace, opens up a whole other discussion. That first position opens up the discussion, Tova, on something so important to you, to all of us, to me, and that is, how do you fight physical anti-Semitism? That second discussion opens up another challenge, and that's the challenge of recognizing that not only are there physical issues that we face, but there's the issue of the chabak, of the spiritual challenge as well. And that's a very, very serious, that's serious stuff. And as Ruby said before, sometimes these challenges can come together, and we're dealing with all of them all at once. But I just want to leave you with one thought, and that is, I want to speak about the word intersectionality, from the word intersection. And this is a word which is commonly used on campus, and it's used in quote unquote progressive arenas. Intersectionality means that if you're involved in one cause, it intersects with all causes. So what would be an example of intersectionality? Intersectionality means that in the world of social justice, in the world of universal concerns, one could be involved in the environment, which is a very important issue. One could be involved in Black-white relations, really, really fighting very strongly, and understanding that every human being is created in the image of God. The color of one's skin is immaterial, shouldn't make one iota of a difference. Rights of women throughout the ages have been put down. And in order to be part of that group, intersectionality says you have to be anti-Israel. I'm talking about the very progressive end. You have to be anti-Israel because Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is a colonial state. Israel is a usurping state. And intersectionality says that if you are pro-Israel, we don't want you in our battle.
Right.
To make sure that the earth, that the environment is going to be protected. Everything intersects. Now, I want to give an example of a young man. I don't want to use myself as an example because I'm not a good example, but I want to use an example of Rabbi Ari Hart for a moment. Or I want to give as an example our own Rabbi Stephen Exler, who was the creme de la creme. When you think about Ari went to Skokie. We all know who he is. When Ari used to speak in the shul, many more people came to shul just to hear him. He's such a different, innovative kind of. I remember sermons I don't remember the sermons I gave. I remember the sermons he gave. Surely I'm going to stop in a minute. And so he goes to Chicago. And his synagogue is the fastest growing synagogue in Chicago. And he's involved in the South Side and during COVID to make sure that those who don't have, that they're provided for. But he is unbending, as Rav Stephen is unbending in their love and commitment to Israel. They may not have my politics, my right-wing politics, but they are, and it's not easy for them. It's not easy. And this is something I think it's so important that we talk about. I love Israel. I love Israel. I know I'm going over time, Ezra. Excuse me just for a minute. I love Israel, not only because it's in my kishkes. This is who I am. This is who I am. Israel is so much a part of me. But I love Israel dafka because I am a progressive. Israel is one of the most progressive countries on the face of this earth. You want to talk about LGBT? Go to Gaza and try to talk about LGBT. Go to Gaza. Let's see how far you're going to get. And that's a big deal. That's a big issue. That the social justice is so powerful that sometimes it erodes and it challenges one's Jewish identity, even Jewish peoplehood, Estelle, even Jewish peoplehood. I'm way over my time, so I want to stop here and just thank you for this wonderful discussion. You can see my voice is going. I know Ted has so much to say and everyone, but this has been a fabulous give and take.
Thank you, Rav Avi.
I thank all of you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
And Shavuot.
Ezra, I know you have a lot to say too about this because Ezra's